Welcome to Starbound's Fantasy channel. My name is Carol, and I'll be your narrator for today. Before we get started with the story, go ahead, check and make sure that you're subscribed. It's 100% free, and it allows our stories to pop up in your feed more often. With that, let's get started.
The elven capital of Esiril had seen many parades, but none quite so offensive to the senses as this one. Captain Roderick Haln led the Queen's Guard through the streets of living crystal, each bootfall leaving muddy apostrophes on the pristine walkways. His armor sang a discordant symphony, chainmail rattling like dice in a gambler's cup, leather straps groaning, steel plates scraping against each other with every step. Behind him, 47 of the Queen's finest knights marched in what the Elves generously called formation, but more closely resembled a tavern brawl trying to walk in the same direction. Cobb grunted, running a thumb over a flawless crystal balustrade as they passed.
Don't trust anything that doesn't need repairs. Means it's never been used for anything real.
Sweet bleeding stars, muttered Lady Tasman Vale, adjusting her grip on the halberd that towered a full head above her. You'd think immortals would have better things to do than gawk. The elves were certainly gawking. They lined the streets in their gossamer robes and moonlight armor, faces arranged in expressions of polite horror. A few of the younger ones, barely a century old, openly giggled at the human procession.
Let 'em laugh,
Roderick said without turning. His voice had the quality of gravel being ground to dust.
Won't be so funny when...
When what, Captain? Tasman interrupted, loud enough for the nearest elves to hear. When they realized we've tracked horse dung through their pretty streets? Because that ship has definitely sailed. From somewhere in the ranks, Cobb's voice rose like a rusty hinge.
Oi! Who told Danrick he could bring his bloody shovel?
It's ceremonial, came the reply from Sir Dunrick, who was, indeed, carrying an entrenching tool strapped to his back alongside the sword.
Ceremonial my ass! You just forgot your polearm again.
I forgot nothing. This beauty's killed more enemies than your fancy hammer.
That's because you keep hitting yourself with it, you half-deaf jit.
The elven honor guard escorting them exchanged glances of disgust and mocking laughter. Their leader, resplendent in armor that seemed to be made of concentrated starlight, leaned toward his second. Are they always like this? Every bloody day, Tasman said cheerfully, having overheard. You should see us when we're actually trying to be offensive. The palace doors ahead were works of art, silver and gold, twisted into patterns that hurt to look at directly. They opened silently, revealing a throne room that made the word opulent feel inadequate. The walls were waterfalls frozen mid-cascade, the ceiling a perfect reproduction of the night sky that moved in real time. The floor reflected everything like a dark mirror, which meant the Queen's Guard could see exactly how out of place they looked. Queen Cyriline of Esiril sat upon a throne, carved a single pearl the size of a small house. She was beauty, distilled into physical form, the kind of perfection that made you want to apologize for existing in the same space. Her court arrayed around her like exotic birds, all silk and shine, and carefully curated poses. Roderick led his knights forward, their boots thundering obscenely in the perfect acoustics. They stopped at what he judged to be the appropriate distance, close enough to be heard without shouting, far enough that their smell wouldn't reach the throne.
Your Radiance,
Roderick said, removing his helmet. His scarred face emerged like a battlefield photograph. One eye was milky white. 3 parallel scars ran from temple to jaw, and his nose had been broken so many times it had given up trying to heal straight.
The Queen of Aldwyn sends her regards, and renews her pledge of alliance.
Queen Cyrilene's expression could have been carved from winter. Captain Haln, We thank your queen for her enthusiasm, though we confess ourselves puzzled by the necessity of this alliance. The Accord of Moonrise has stood for 3 centuries, a formality more than. She was interrupted by one of her courtiers, a younger elf whose robes probably cost more than a village.
Your Radiance, if I may? Perhaps our human's guests would be more comfortable in the servants' quarters? The smell is really quite...
Finish that sentence, Tasman said conversationally, and I'll demonstrate why this halberd's name is wickedness. The elf's perfect features twisted in amusement.
You would threaten violence in the Queen's own hall? How delightfully predictable.
Wasn't a threat, Sparkles. Just a weather forecast. Cloudy with a chance of bisection.
Tasman,
Roderick warned, though his tone suggested he was warning her more about wasting energy than about diplomacy. Queen Saraline raised one perfect hand. Peace. We shall conclude this formality quickly. The alliance stands, as it has always stood. Though, truly, what need have we of human swords, when elven magic has kept the dark at bay for millennia?
Magic's all well and good.
Cobb spoke up from where he was examining a pillar with professional interest.
Till it isn't.
The Queen's gaze sharpened. You dare suggest... The doors exploded inward. Not metaphorically. The massive, priceless, irreplaceable doors burst into splinters as something huge and wrong forced its way through. The messenger who stumbled through the wreckage was an elf, but only in the academic sense. Half his face was simply gone, replaced by spreading black veins that pulsed with their own terrible life. His robes were scorched and melting, revealing flesh beneath that looked like it was trying to crawl away from his bones.
Silverpine!
He gasped, and his voice was the sound of things drowning.
Gone! The garrison! The towers!
He collapsed, and where he hit the perfect floor, the reflection cracked and went dark. The throne room erupted. Elves scattered like startled birds, magic flaring in panicked bursts. Spells of protection, divination, and communication filled the air in a rainbow of panic. Roderick's knights didn't move. They'd formed a defensive circle before the messenger hit the ground, shields up, weapons ready. It was ugly and practical, and everything the elves' response wasn't.
Report!
Roderick barked at Cobb, who was already kneeling by the messenger's body.
Dead,
Cobb said, then corrected himself.
More than dead. Look at this.
He lifted the elf's hand. The fingers were already crumbling to ash, but the ash didn't fall. It hung in the air, forming shapes that hurt to perceive.
It's eaten him. Even now, it's...
The messenger's body convulsed. His remaining eye snapped open, but what looked out wasn't him anymore.
Magic dies,
it said in a voice like breaking glass.
Flesh remains. The blight comes to feast.
Then the body collapsed entirely, leaving only shadow and the smell of things that should not be. Queen Saraline stood, her perfect composure cracked. Silverpine is 3 days' ride. If it fell yesterday...
It's moving fast, Roderick finished. Your Radiance, with respect, forget the pretty spells. You need steel. We need nothing from humans.
The young courtier from before stepped forward, magic crackling around his fingers.
Silverpine fell because they were unprepared. We are the heart of elven power. We are...
The magic around his fingers sputtered and died. He stared at his hands in horror, then at the spreading stain of absolute darkness where the messenger had died.
Cobb,
Roderick said quietly.
How long?
The smith was backing away from the dark spot, which was definitely getting larger.
Minutes? Maybe less. It's not just eating magic, Captain. It's eating the idea of magic. Right then.
Roderick raised his voice.
Your Radiance, the alliance your ancestors signed with ours included provisions for exactly this sort of thing. I'm invoking them now. By the Accord of Moonrise, I'm assuming military command for the defense of Isseril.
The throne room went silent, except for the sound of spreading darkness.
You cannot!
Queen Seraline began.
I can, and I am.
Roderick turned to his knights.
Tasman, take Dunrick and secure the armory. Real weapons, not the fancy stuff. Cobb, I need every smith in the city working on armor. Chainmail, plate, I don't care if it's made from cooking pots. Anything that'll stop a blade.
Captain! One of the elven generals stepped forward, his crystalline armor catching the light.
You overstep. We have defended this realm since before your ancestors crawled from the mud.
The darkness reached the base of the nearest pillar. The pillar, which had stood for 1,000 years and been carved from a single piece of starstone, crumbled like chalk in rain.
You were saying?
Tasman asked sweetly. The general's hand went to his sword, a blade of pure moonlight that had never known defeat. He drew it in one perfect motion. The blade came out as rust and memory.
Shit,
the general said, and it was probably the most human thing any of them had ever heard an elf say.
Now then,
Roderick said, as chaos erupted around them.
Let's talk about what real war looks like.
The Elven War Council was convened in what they called the Chamber of Eternal Victory, which Tasman felt was tempting fate even by elven standards. The spreading darkness had been temporarily contained by the simple expedient of Cobb suggesting they knock down the affected walls and burn everything within 50 feet, a solution that had horrified the elves almost as much as the blight itself.
Barbarity!
General Ladarius said for the 4th time. He'd found a new sword, ordinary steel, traded from a very confused human merchant for approximately its weight in gold. He kept looking at it like it might bite him.
To destroy the Moonrise Gallery. Artworks that have stood since before my ancestors crawled from the mud, yes. We've established this timeline.
Roderick stood at the war table, studying maps with the kind of focus that suggested he was avoiding punching someone.
Would you prefer we let the Blight have them? I'm sure it would appreciate the cultural significance while it devours your city.
Queen Seraline sat at the head of the table, and credit where it was due, she adapted faster than most. The crown was gone, replaced by what Tasman recognized as a helm that actually protected the head. Novel concept.
What do we do now?
The queen asked.
16 cities, confirmed dark,
an elven scout reported. He was one of the few who'd made it back, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd seen the world break.
The pattern suggests northwest to southeast, following the ley lines.
Roderick interrupted.
It's not random. The Blight's following your magical network, like a disease, through veins.
That's not possible, Ladarius said. The ley lines are protected by magic, Cobb finished. He was surrounded by maps, chalk, and the kind of mathematical equations that made Tasman's head hurt.
Which is exactly what this thing eats. Captain, if I'm right, and I usually am about things that'll kill us, it'll hit the ground convergence in about 6 days.
Every elf in the room went pale. The Grand Convergence was where all the continental ley lines met, the heart of elven power. If it reaches that... Queen Seraline didn't finish. She didn't need to.
Right then, Roderick said. We need to stop it before it gets there. Tasman, what's our status?
47 knights ready to fight. Another 100 men-at-arms from the embassy garrison. Found about 300 elves who actually know which end of a sword is the sharp bit. She paused. Also, Dunric's teaching a bunch of younglings something he calls combat geometry. I'm afraid to ask.
It's very simple,
Dunric's voice carried from the courtyard where he was drilling recruits.
You calculate the angle of descent, factor in wind resistance. No, not magical wind, you sparkly jit. Actual wind. Then you drop the biggest rock you can find.
There was a crash, followed by cheering. He's got them dropping stones from the towers, Tasman explained. Turns out elves are very good at math when their lives depend on it.
Good. We'll need...
Roderick was interrupted by the door slamming open. The elf who entered looked like he'd crawled through hells and back. His robes were torn, his perfect features marred by very imperfect bruises, and he was carrying...
Is that a shovel?
Ladarius asked in horror.
The combat shovel,
the elf corrected, panting.
Squire Shovel gave it to me. Said it would...
He paused, seeming to realize he was in the presence of his queen.
Your Radiance. Lord Commander, the darkness has breached the outer gardens. It'll reach the first ward within the hour.
Tasman glanced at Roderick. Shovel? That's what they're calling the young squiresmith from the embassy? The one who thinks a sharpened spade is the height of military technology.
If it keeps people alive, it is,
Roderick said curtly. How did it move so fast? Saraline stood, reaching instinctively for magic that flickered and died at her fingertips.
It's learning,
Roderick said grimly.
Each city it takes, it gets faster, smarter. We need to move. Now!
The journey to the outer defenses was a masterclass in controlled chaos. Elven civilians streamed inward, carrying what they could. Human knights formed moving walls of steel, shepherding the evacuation with the kind of efficiency that came from long practice.
Stay together! Keep moving! Leave the bloody harp, you pompous peacock!
That was Sergeant Grek, a man who looked like someone had carved a soldier out of beef and spite. An elderly elf clutched at a floating chest that flickered between solid and translucent.
But it contains my life's work! Symphonies that took centuries to...
The chest flickered one last time and dissolved into nothing. The elf stared at his empty hands.
Now will you bloody move?
Grek grabbed the elf and practically threw him toward safety. The outer garden had been beautiful once. Now it was a battlefield, and not the glorious kind the elves sang about. This was ugly, desperate, and mean. The blight had manifested here not as darkness, but as wrongness. Trees that had grown for millennia were twisted into shapes that violated geometry. The famous whispering fountains now screamed. And moving through it all were things that had once been animals, now remade into engines of consumption.
Shields!
Roderick's voice cut through the chaos. The human line locked together, a wall of steel and determination. Behind them, elves fumbled with unfamiliar weapons, trying to remember Tasman's crash course in How Not to Die.
Remember,
she called out.
Steel doesn't care about your bloodline. It doesn't need you to believe in it. It just needs you to swing it very hard at things you don't like.
The first wave hit like a tide of teeth and hunger. A blight beast, something that might have been a deer in a previous life, charged the line. Its antlers were broken fractals that hurt to perceive. Its eyes were holes in the world. It met Roderick's shield and discovered that while magic might die, physics were eternal. The impact drove Roderick back a step, his boots carving furrows in the ground. But the shield held, and his sword, ordinary, ugly, perfect steel, took the thing's head off in a spray of something that wasn't quite blood.
They die!
He roared,
You hear that, you beautiful immortal bastards? They die! Just gotta hit 'em hard enough.
The battle was everything the songs never mentioned. It was Cobb, frantically patching armor between waves, using leather torn from decorative banners. It was Dunrick directing his artillery, teenage elves with rocks and mathematical enthusiasm. It was Tasman dancing between nightmares, her halberd writing ugly poetry in the air. And it was the elves learning, adapting, surviving. Lady Tasman! An elven recruit, the same young courtier who'd insulted them, now wearing borrowed mail that didn't quite fit, pointed at a cluster of blight beasts flanking their position.
What do we do?
What do you think we do, Sparkles? She decapitated something that had too many mouths. You take the sword I gave you, and you introduce it to their internal organs.
But there's so many!
Then you'll get lots of practice. The elf stared at her, then at the approaching horrors, then at the sword in his hand. Something shifted in his perfect features, a recognition that the world had changed, and he could either change with it or die as he was. He charged. It wasn't graceful. He stumbled, swung wild, missed completely. A blight beast's claw caught his mail, punching through the rings to score flesh beneath. He screamed, not the musical cry of elven epics, but the raw sound of pain and fury. And then he swung again, and this time he didn't miss.
That's it!
Tasman laughed, wild and fierce.
Ugly as sin and twice as effective.
The battle raged for 6 hours. 6 hours of steel meeting nightmare, of physics defying metaphysics, of mortality splitting in eternity's eye. When it ended, the outer gardens were gone. In their place was a moonscape of churned earth and broken stones. But the line had held. Roderick surveyed the aftermath, counting heads. They'd lost 12 knights. Good men and women all. But they'd held. And more importantly...
Captain.
The young elf courtier approached. His perfect robes were ruined, replaced by blood-stained mail. His face bore a scar that would never quite heal right. His sword was notched and dirty. He'd never looked more alive.
I believe I owe you an apology, he said. I called your methods primitive.
They are primitive, Roderick agreed. Yes. The elf smiled, and it was a human expression, all teeth and fierce joy.
Beautifully so.
Behind them, Cobb was already setting up field forges. The sound of hammers on steel began to ring out, a percussion that drowned out the dying screams of magic. Right then, Tasman said, cleaning her halberd. Who wants to learn about flanking maneuvers? A forest of elven hands went up. The Queen's Guard had come to renew an alliance. They were building an army instead. 3 days later, the combined forces that made camp at Thornwatch Ridge, the last defensive position before the Grand Convergence, what had started as 47 human knights and a handful of desperate elves, had grown into something unusual, a mongrel army of steel and stubbornness. I still can't believe it's working, Queen Saraline said, watching elven warriors practice formations that would have horrified their ancestors. Where once they'd moved like dancers, now they moved like soldiers, efficient, brutal, and alive. She was quiet for a moment, then added softly, For centuries, we called it perfection, but it was stagnation. We polished the past until it was a mirror and never saw the future rushing up behind us. This ugliness. It is the first new thing our culture has created in 1,000 years.
Belief's got nothing to do with it,
Cobb said, not looking up from the armor he was modifying. He'd taken elven ceremonial plate and committed what they considered sacrilege, cutting away the decorative elements, adding leather joints, creating function from form.
Steel doesn't need faith, just maintenance.
The camp was a study in controlled chaos. Elves who'd never touched cookware were learning to prepare field rations. Warriors who once summoned food from pure magic were discovering the dubious joys of hardtack and mystery stew.
What's in this?
Lord Farrendil asked, poking his bowl suspiciously.
Better not to ask,
Shovel advised. The unknighted squiresmith had become something of a legend after holding a bridge single-handedly with his entrenching tool. 3 elven nobles had just offered to knight him. He declined, saying he didn't want to insult his shovel with a fancy title.
Just eat it and be grateful it's not moving. It's not moving, is it?
Farrendil checked.
Not anymore.
Across the camp, Dunrick had set up what he called his Academy of Applied Violence. His students, a mix of elven youth and human squires, were learning that warfare was less about glory and more about angles.
Right then, you sparkly gits, watch close!
Dunrick demonstrated with a training dummy.
Enemies taller than you? Good! Means their center of gravity's higher. Hit 'em here.
He struck the dummy's knee.
And physics does the rest. Don't need to be strong when you're smart. And if you're like me and you got your bell rung one too many times, you better be smart.
Sir Dunrick? One of the elven students raised a hand. What if they're wearing armor?
Then you hit 'em harder. Or find a gap. Armpits, groin, back of the knee. Ugly places for ugly work.
He grinned, his scarred face crinkling.
Remember, chivalry's for people who can afford to lose. We can't.
Tasman watched from her perch on a supply wagon, cleaning wickedness with the kind of care most people reserve for newborns. The transformation in the elves was remarkable. They'd gone from ethereal to earthy in record time, and while they still had their pride, it was a different kind now. Earned, not inherited.
Copper for your thoughts?
Roderick approached, looking like he'd been awake since the invention of consciousness.
Just wondering if we're gonna live long enough to see how this story ends,
Tasman said. The scouts' reports.
I know.
Roderick's expression looked like it could have been carved from granite.
The blight's moving faster. It'll reach the convergence tomorrow. Maybe the day after, if we're lucky.
And our chances?
Somewhere between slim and none. Leaning toward none.
He paused.
But then again, our chances of getting this far were about the same.
Cheerful. You should give motivational speeches.
I leave that to you. You're better at lying.
They were interrupted by a commotion near the medical tents. An elven scout had returned, but something was wrong. His horse was lathered in sweat and blood. Not all of it the horse's.
Report!
Roderick commanded, as the scout half fell from his saddle.
The blight!
The elf gasped.
It's not just consuming anymore. It's thinking, planning. There's something leading it. Something? I saw it.
The scout's eyes were wild, with more than fear.
It wore a shape. Like an elf, but wrong. Like someone's memory of beauty. Turned inside out. It spoke. What did it say? The feast begins with the sweetest meat.
The scout shuddered.
It's coming here. Tonight. With an army of things that used to be alive.
The camp exploded into motion. There was no panic. Roderick had drilled that out of them. But there was urgency. Weapons were checked. Armor donned. Positions taken.
How long?
Roderick asked.
2 hours. Maybe less. Right. Roderick raised his voice. Listen up, you beautiful bastards. The enemy's coming early to the party. Rude of them, but we'll make do. Formation Delta 3. Elves on the flanks, humans at the center. Dunrick, I want your artillery ready to sing. Cobb, already on it, Captain. The smith was distributing his latest innovation, arrows and bolts, with heads made from melted down elven jewelry. Turns out their precious metals make decent projectiles when you stop caring about the artistic merit. Tasman, you're with me at the point.
Wouldn't be anywhere else. She stood, shouldering wickedness. Though, I notice you always put me where fighting's the thickest.
That's because you're too mean to die.
Flatterer. As the sun set, and what a sunset it was, all blood and prophecy, the army formed up on Thornwatch Ridge. It wasn't the largest force ever assembled, or the most powerful, but it might have been the most stubborn. The elves had learned human war chants, simple, rhythmic things that were more about unity than melody. The humans had learned elven battle readiness rituals, discovering that even without magic, there was power in preparation. Together, they waited. The blight announced itself with silence. Birds stopped singing. Insects went quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And then, at the edge of vision, darkness began to rise like a tide.
Steady, Roderick called. Remember your training. Trust your steel. Trust each other.
The first wave came as shadows given hunger. Things that might have been wolves, or bears, or worse, loping across the killing field with lithe grace. Behind them, larger shapes moved. Corrupted treants, their bark weeping black sap, their branches reaching like desperate fingers.
Artillery!
Dunrick's voice cracked like a whip.
Elevation! 30 degrees! Remember to account for wind! Ready! Ready! Loose!
The sky filled with death. Not magical death, not elegant death, but the simple, brutal death of heavy objects falling very fast from very high. Boulders crashed into the advancing horde, and the beautiful thing about physics was that it didn't care if you were mortal or monster. Mass times acceleration equaled splatter.
That's my boys and girls! Dunrick cheered. Reload! Let's give 'em another dose of reality.
The blight beast that survived the barrage met the shield wall. This time, the elves held their ground alongside the humans, their borrowed steel singing the same ugly song.
Push!
Roderick commanded, and the line surged forward as one. An elf beside Tasman, she thought his name was Sylvian, took a claw to the face. His helm turned it from fatal to merely disfiguring. He stabbed back with the desperate fury of someone who just discovered they very much wanted to keep living.
Good!
Tasman encouraged, separating a blight beast from several important pieces of itself.
Scars are just proof you were interesting enough to survive. My mother will be horrified, Sylvian laughed, high and wild.
Then we're doing something right. The battle raged under stars that seemed too distant to care. Steel met shadow, determination met hunger, and slowly, the line held. Then the true enemy revealed itself. It came through the ranks of blight beasts like silk through water, and Tasman understood why the scout had been so disturbed. It had the shape of an elf, yes, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too graceful, too perfect. Its beauty hurt to perceive, like staring at the sun through a prism of ice.
I am Nephis,
it spoke, and its voice was the sound of ending things.
I am the feast and the famine. the question and the absence of answers. You are creatures of meat and moments. You dare stand before the eternal.
We dare. Queen Saraline stepped forward, and there was steel in her voice to match the steel in her hand.
We are the children of starlight, and the children of earth, united in the only truth that matters. We choose to live.
Nethys laughed, and flowers died.
Choice. You speak of choice? I will show you the only choice that matters. Kneel, or be consumed.
How about option 3?
Roderick suggested.
Which is?
Hit you very hard with sharp things until you stop moving.
Nethys moved. It didn't walk. It simply existed in a new location, directly in front of the human captain. One perfect hand reached out, touched Roderick's breastplate, and nothing happened.
This cannot be,
Nethys whispered.
Nope,
Cobb called from his position.
just good metallurgy. Folded steel treated with salt and honest sweat. Turns out the only thing that stops magic-eating monsters is something that never had magic to begin with.
Roderick's sword took Nethys in what would have been its kidney if it had normal anatomy. The creature screamed, not in pain, but in outrage that pain was even possible. The battle became a melee. Nethys danced between warriors, its touch withering everything magical. But the humans and retrained elves pressed in with mundane steel and mortal fury. Every wound they inflicted was small, but they accumulated like interest on a debt.
Circle it, Tasman commanded. Don't let it focus on any one fighter.
It was ugly. Nethys was a creature of terrible beauty, fighting beings who'd embrace functional ugliness. Its movements were poetry. Theirs were prose. Subject, verb, stab. Shovel got in close, his entrenching tool ringing against Nethys' form like a bell. The creature backhanded him, sending him flying, but Farandel was there to take his place, the former courtier fighting with more enthusiasm than skill.
You insects,
Nethys raged.
You dare make me bleed!
And it was bleeding, or at least leaking something that might have been ichor, if ichor could scream.
That's the plan.
Dunrick had abandoned his artillery command to join the fray, his weighted club making music against Nethys' bones.
Bleed a lot. Fall down. Stop moving. Simple, really.
The tide turned not with a grand gesture, but with accumulation. 1,000 cuts, 100 bruises, the weight of mortal determination pressing down like gravity itself. Nethys stumbled, just once, just for a moment. Roderick and Tasman moved as one. His sword took Nethys high, hers took it low. The creature fell to its knees, looking somehow surprised that knees were even an option.
This isn't possible,
it whispered.
I am eternal. I am.
You're done, Queen Saraline said quietly. She stood before the creature, steel steady in her hand. We gave up eternity for this moment. We traded perfection for survival. And that's why we win. Her blade came down like judgment. Nethys died. It wasn't beautiful, or poetic, or meaningful. It simply stopped. And with it stopping, the Blight army collapsed. Shadows fled back to being shadows. Corrupted beasts fell apart into component memories. The darkness that had been advancing, like inexorable death, retreated. They stood there in the aftermath, humans and elves, bloodied and breathing, and alive.
Is it over? Someone asked. This battle, Roderick said, watching the darkness recede. Not the war. The convergence is still threatened, but... He looked around at his mongrel army, these beings who'd learned that survival trumped style. I like our chances. Captain. Sylvian approached, his face a ruin of scars that somehow made him look more real than he'd ever been. Permission to make an observation? Granted. I think I understand now. Why humans build things to last, why you maintain instead of simply remaking. He touched his scarred face. Because the damage is part of the story. The repairs show we chose to continue. Philosophy from someone who just hit a nightmare with a borrowed sword, Tasman mused. The world really is ending. No, Queen Saraline said firmly. It's beginning. Differently than we expected, uglier than we'd hoped, but beginning nonetheless. They made camp among the dead, too tired to return to their previous position. Cobb immediately began collecting salvageable metal. Waste not, want not. Dunrick started calculating new trajectories for tomorrow's battles. The elven cooks began preparing what would generously be called food. And overhead, the stars looked exactly the same as they always had, which was somehow the most comforting thing of all. Tomorrow, we march on the convergence, Roderick announced. Get some rest. Maintain your gear. Eat something horrible. Stay alive. The most inspiring speech in military history, Tasman muttered, but she was smiling. As the camp settled into exhausted sleep, Shovel sat with his entrenching tool across his knees, standing watch. An elf approached, one of the young nobles who'd been transformed by recent events. I would learn, the elf said simply. The way of the shovel. Shovel looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. First lesson, it's not about the shovel. It's about the willingness to dig, to get dirty, to do the work nobody songs about. I understand. No, but you will. They sat together in companionable silence, the unknighted and the formerly noble, watching the horizon for signs of tomorrow's horrors. The war wasn't over. The convergence still needed defending. The blight was wounded, not dead. But for the first time since the darkness had come, they had something more powerful than magic. They had proven that steel and stubbornness could make even nightmares bleed. The grand convergence rose from the earth like a broken promise. Once, it had been the jewel of elven civilization. 7 towers of living crystal, arranged in perfect symmetry, each one a tuning fork for the world's magic. Now, 3 of the towers were dark. Their crystal turned into something that ate light. The remaining 4 flickered like dying candles. 2 days forced march. This is what we get to see. Sergeant Grek spat. Bloody depressing if you ask me. Nobody asked you, Tasman said, but her heart wasn't in the banter. The corrupted towers were wrong, in a way that made her teeth ache. The combined army, now nearly 3,000 strong after gathering stragglers and survivors, made camp on the final approach. The convergence sat in a natural bowl, surrounded by cliffs on 3 sides. 1 way in, 1 way out. Perfect for defense, terrible for retreat. It's a killing field, Roderick observed, studying the terrain with Cobb and Queen Saraline. If we fail here... Then we fail permanently, Saraline finished. The convergence doesn't just channel magic. It is magic, given form. If the blight consumes it entirely... No more magic, ever, anywhere.
Cobb was sketching fortification plans with charcoal on leather.
On the bright side, we won't have to worry about it for long. The magical races, elves, dwarves, and the others, they'll just stop.
Define stop, Tasman said.
Cease. End. Return to the earth that made them.
Saraline's voice was steady, but her knuckles were white on her sword hilts.
We were never meant to be permanent. Magic made us more than mortal. Without it,
You'll be like us, Roderick said quietly. Just people.
if we're lucky,
She managed a smile.
though after the last week, I'm beginning to think there are worse fates.
They spent the night in preparation. Not the mystical preparations of elven tradition, but the practical sort. Sharpening blades, patching armor, making peace with mortality. The mixed forces had developed their own rituals, ugly little ceremonies that would have horrified both cultures a week ago. Elves helped humans oil their mail, learning the meditation and maintenance. Humans joined elves in their remembrance circles, discovering that grief sounded the same in any language. They ate together, fought together, complained about Cobb's field rations together.
I want to make something clear.
Roderick addressed the assembled forces as dawn approached.
What we do today isn't about glory. It isn't about songs or stories. It's about buying time. The mages.
He nodded to a small group of elven scholars who'd been working frantically on a solution.
Tell me they might have a way to seal the blight, but they need ours. We don't have.
So, we give them those hours, Tasman continued. We hold the line until we can't, and then we hold it anyway.
Some of us won't see sunset.
Roderick's scarred face was calm.
Most of us, probably.
But everyone who falls buys minutes, and minutes add up to the world continuing to exist.
That's the exchange rate. That's the deal.
Cheerful as always, Captain, Dunrick called out. You should really write greeting cards. Sorry for your loss, but at least the world didn't end. Has a ring to it, someone replied, and nervous laughter rippled through the ranks. As the sun rose, because it always did, indifferent to mortal terror, they saw what they faced. The blight had masked everything for this final assault. The darkness moved like a living thing, and within it, shapes that hurt to perceive. Not just corrupted animals now, but the remains of entire cities, given hunger and purpose. And at its heart, something worse than Nethys. Something that had never been mortal at all.
Right then,
Roderick said, donning his helm.
Form up! 3 lines, rotating defense. Dunrick, you have the high ground. Make it rain. Shovel, I want you and your diggers ready to... Already done, Captain.
Shovel had spent the night with his converts, nearly 100 elves who'd embraced the way of practical earth-moving.
Trenches, pit traps, some surprises.
Turns out elves are very good at geometry when you explain it involves dropping enemies into holes.
Good man. Tasman?
Front and center with the ugliest bastards we have. She hefted wickedness, which, after a week of your training, is everyone.
Your Majesty.
Roderick turned to Saraline.
I'd ask you to stay back, but...
But you know better.
The Elven Queen had traded her remaining finery for practical steel.
I stand with my people. All of them.
The blight attacked with the patience of entropy. It didn't charge. It advanced like fog, inevitable and encompassing. Where it touched the earth itself died. Not dramatically, but with quiet surrender. Grass became ash. Stone became sand. The air itself grew thin.
Hold!
Roderick commanded, though every instinct screamed to either charge or flee. The first probing attacks came as whispers of shadow, formless things testing their defenses. Arrows met them, iron-tipped and rudely material. Some shadows fell. Others learned.
They're adapting,
Cobb observed, never stopping his work reinforcing armor, even as battle loomed.
getting solid where our weapons hit, staying ethereal elsewhere. Then we hit 'em everywhere, Tasman said. Front rank, execute maneuver, hit everything very hard.
It wasn't in any military manual, but they'd drilled it enough. The shield wall surged forward, not in a charge, but in a controlled advance. Steel met shadow, and shadow gave way. Slowly, grudgingly, but it gave. For an hour they held. The 3-line rotation Roderick had devised meant fresh fighters constantly cycled to the front, while the exhausted fell back to have armor patched and wounds bound. It was ugly, mechanical, and absolutely effective. Then the true enemy revealed itself. It rose from the center of the blight like a mountain being born. Where Nethys had been wrongly beautiful, this was wrongly vast. It had no fixed form. One moment a giant of rotting starlight, the next a dragon of inverse fire, then something that the eyes refused to process.
The feast reaches its crescendo,
It spoke in a voice that was the absence of sound.
I am the hunger between stars. I am the question that breaks the asking. I am...
Really fond of the sound of your own voice, Tasman interrupted. We get it. You're very impressive. Can we skip to the part where we try to kill each other? The entity paused, apparently unprepared for mockery. In that moment of confusion, Dunrick's artillery spoke. Boulders, ballista bolts, and everything else they could launch filled the air. Most passed through the entity harmlessly, but some struck whatever passed for solid. And when they did...
It bleeds!
Someone shouted.
The big bastard bleeds!
It wasn't blood exactly, more like reality leaking from wounds. But it was proof of vulnerability. The entity roared and attacked in earnest. The battle became a nightmare of attrition. The blight pressed from all sides, while the entity struck from above, each blow crushing sections of the defensive line. But where one fell, another stepped forward. Human and elf, they filled the gaps with their bodies and their determination.
Second line, advance! First line, fall back!
Roderick's voice cut through the chaos, maintaining order through sheer will.
Can't fall back!
Sergeant Grek called.
Too many wounded! Then we hold here!
The entity focused on Roderick then, recognizing command. It descended like judgment, one massive appendage of crystallized nothing sweeping down. Shovel was there. The unknighted squiresmith met the blow with his entrenching tool, and the clash sent shockwaves through both armies. He held for 1 second, then 2, before being driven to one knee.
Some help would be nice,
he ground out. The response came from everywhere. Arrows, spears, thrown weapons, anything that could reach. But more importantly, the elven scholars cried out in unison.
We have it! The seal! But we need time!
Roderick finished.
All units, final defense! This is where we stand!
What followed would never be sung in the old way. There was no grace to it, no beauty. Just beings who decided that tomorrow was worth bleeding for today. The Queen's Guard formed the core, shields locked. making themselves into a wall of meat and iron. Around them, elves who'd learned that survival was uglier and more precious than perfection filled the gaps. They fought with shovels and swords, with stones and stubbornness. Cobb had given up on repairs, his hammer serving a more immediate purpose. Dunrick had abandoned his artillery to stand in the line, his calculations replaced by the simple math of strike and counterstrike. Even the cooks fought, wielding ladles and cleavers with desperate efficiency. And at the heart of it all, Tasman danced her ugly dance, wickedness painting the air, with ending after ending.
How much longer?
Roderick demanded, half his armor torn away, blood running from a dozen wounds.
Minutes!
The lead scholar cried.
We need minutes! You heard him!
Roderick's voice rose above the din.
Minutes! We hold for minutes!
The entity pressed harder, reality bending under its assault. The defensive line buckled, reformed, buckled again. Bodies piled up, human and elf indistinguishable in death. But they held.
I take it back,
Sylvian gasped, his scarred face split in a mad grin as he fought beside Tasman.
This is definitely worth a song. A terrible song that no one will want to hear, but still.
Focus on living through it first, Tasman advised, separating something unfortunate from its method of locomotion. The entity made one final push, pouring all its wrongness into a blow that would shatter any defense.
Now!
The scholars screamed. Light erupted from the remaining towers. Not the gentle light of elven magic, but something harder, more desperate. It was every sunset ever seen, every candle lit against the dark, every star that refused to go gentle into that good night. The entity recoiled, its form wavering.
The seal! Drive it back to the seal! You heard him.
Roderick raised his notched sword.
One more push! One more!
They advanced. Not in formation, they were beyond such niceties. They advanced as a mob, as a mass, as a single organism that had decided it was done being prey. The entity retreated step by step, herded by steel and determination, toward the center of the convergence, where the scholars had prepared their trap. It fought every inch, lashing out with appendages of unbeing, but the wall of meat and iron pressed forward.
Almost!
The lead scholar's voice was strained.
Almost!
The entity realized the trap too late. The seal activated, not with the pure light of traditional magic, but with something hybrid, something born from the fusion of elven knowledge and human stubbornness. It was ugly patchwork, held together by will more than skill. It was perfect. The entity's scream shattered the remaining windows in the convergence. It clawed at reality, trying to escape, but the seal held. Layer by layer, it was compressed, contained, constrained.
It's working,
Saraline breathed. And then, with a sound like the world's largest door slamming shut, it was over. The entity was gone. The blight, cut off from its source, withered like plants in an oven. The darkness that had threatened to consume the world stopped. They stood there in the aftermath, the survivors, too exhausted to celebrate. The grand convergence was scarred, but standing. Of the 3,000 who'd marched here, perhaps half remained, and most of those bore wounds that would never fully heal. Roderick stepped away from the others for a moment, reaching into his belt pouch. He pulled out a small leather cord, worn smooth by years of handling. It belonged to Sergeant Harwick, one of the 12 who'd fallen in that first desperate battle. He looked at it for a heartbeat, then tucked it away and returned to his duties. The dead deserved remembrance. But the living needed leadership. Is it... Someone started. It's sealed, the lead scholar confirmed, sagging with relief. Not destroyed. We couldn't manage that, but sealed. Contain. It'll hold for long enough. Centuries, maybe more, if we maintain it.
Maintenance, Cobb laughed, the sound rusty with exhaustion. There's a job for life.
As the sun set, because it had the audacity to keep its schedule despite the day's events, they began the grim work of sorting the living from the dead. Humans and elves worked side by side, no longer concerned with the distinctions that had once seemed so important. We did it, Sylvian said wonderingly. We actually did it.
At a cost,
Roderick said quietly. He was cataloging faces, noting who'd never complain about Cobb's cooking again, who'd never make another shot, who'd never crack another inappropriate joke at exactly the right moment. Yes, Queen Saraline agreed. But isn't that what makes it worth something? We chose to pay it. Together. As night fell, they lit fires, not for warmth, but for light, for the simple mortal comfort of pushing back the dark, just a little. Around those fires they sat without regard for rank or race. They ate. Cobb had somehow found ingredients for a stew that was only mostly awful. They drank. Someone had saved a cask of ale for either victory or a glorious last toast. And they remembered.
To the fallen!
Roderick raised his cup. To the fallen! They echoed. To the living, Tasman added. To the living! To tomorrow, Saraline finished. To tomorrow. Shovel sat apart, his faithful entrenching tool across his knees. Dunrick found him there, and, for a while, they shared the comfortable silence of warriors who'd outlived a war.
Ever think you'd see it? Dunrick asked eventually. Elves fighting like humans. Humans thinking like elves. No, Shovel admitted. But then, I never thought I'd hold off a cosmic horror with garden equipment either. Strange times. The strangest.
Dunrick poured a flask from somewhere, took a swig, and passed it over.
Think it'll last? This, whatever this is we've built.
Shovel considered the question, looking at the mingled forces around the fires. Elves showing human scars like trophies. Humans teaching elves drinking songs that would make their ancestors weep. Queen Saraline herself, sitting on the ground like common infantry, laughing at one of Greg's horrible jokes.
Maybe, he said finally, if we're careful, if we remember, if we maintain it,
Dunrick finished, and they both laughed. 5 months later, the forge at Hollow Reach sang with purposeful noise. It was a new settlement, built where the old borders between human and elven lands used to be. Nobody talked about borders anymore. They were too busy building. Cobb worked the bellows while his latest apprentice, an elf who'd once scorned metalwork as beneath his station, carefully folded steel for what would become a guardsman's blade. Not a magical blade, not an elegant blade, but a blade that would cut when it needed to, and last long enough to pass down to children who'd never known a world split by more than geography.
Remember, Cobb instructed, the impurities make it stronger. Too pure and it's brittle. You need a little corruption, a little dirt. Like people, really.
Across the yard, Tasman oversaw a weapons drill. Her students were the usual mix. Young humans learning their first forms, older elves unlearning centuries of habits, and everyone in between. Wickedness rested nearby, retirement having agreed with the old halberd.
No, no, no,
she barked at an unfortunate trainee.
You're thinking too much. Combat's like dancing. If you're counting steps, you're already dead. Feel it. React. And for the love of rusted steel, stop trying to make it pretty.
In the command tower, Roderick met with what they'd taken to calling the Combined Council. Queen Saraline was there, though she'd traded her crown for the more practical circlet that wouldn't get in the way of a helm. The human queen's representative sat beside her, along with leaders from a dozen communities that had sprung up along the new trade routes.
The seal's holding,
the elven scholar reported. He bore scars now, not from battle, but from the constant work of maintaining the barrier that kept the blight at bay.
Though it requires constant attention.
Everything worthwhile does, Roderick observed.
What else?
They discussed trade, training rotations, and the thousand small details that made civilization work. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't the stuff of legends. It was just people doing the work. Later, as sunset approached, Roderick found himself on the walls. Tasman joined him, as she always did for this ritual.
Regrets?
She asked.
Every day.
You? Only about the ones we couldn't save. She paused. And maybe about letting Cobb name the new tavern.
The Rusty Spoon? Really?
Could be worse.
How?
He wanted to call it the Comfortable Coffin. They stood in companionable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of ending and beginning.
Think they'll remember?
Tasman asked eventually.
Not the glory.
I know that'll get polished up and ruined by storytellers, but
the important bits. That survival's ugly. That working together is harder and more valuable than working alone.
That maintenance matters more than magic. Roderick considered the question, watching the mixed patrols make their rounds, seeing the way human and elf had learned each other's strengths and shored up each other's weaknesses.
Some will,
he said finally.
Enough will. And the ones who forget, well, they'll have the ones to remember to remind them.
With swords, if necessary?
If necessary. But hopefully with words first.
Getting soft in your old age, Captain.
Maybe. Or maybe just smart enough to know that the hardest battles are the ones you don't have to fight.
Below them, the settlement bustled with life. Forges rang. Children played, human and elf together, inventing games that would have horrified purists from both cultures. Someone was singing, badly, but with enthusiasm. It wasn't paradise. It wasn't even particularly pretty. But it was alive and real, and theirs.
Come on, Tasman said eventually. Cobb's threatening to cook tonight, and someone needs to stop him before he invents a new war crime.
They descended from the walls, arguing about whether Cobb's stew violated more natural laws than the blight had. Behind them, the first stars began to appear, unchanged and unchangeable, keeping watch over a world that had learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes the best magic is no magic at all, just steel and sweat, and the stubborn refusal to let the darkness win. Somewhere in the settlement, a hammer rang against an anvil, maintaining the tools that maintained the peace. The rust never sleeps. Neither do those who stand against it. And in that truth, ugly and practical and absolutely unshakable, lay the foundation of every tomorrow worth fighting for.